In the summer of 1683, the largest army Europe had seen in a century stood outside the walls of Vienna. And inside those walls, 16,000 exhausted men understood that if the city fell before September, there would be no Poland, no Austria, no Holy Roman Empire, and no recognizable map of Christian Europe by winter. This was not a siege. This was the final move in a 200-year campaign to decide whether the continent would be governed from Constantinople or remain fractured, chaotic, and free. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power, had committed everything to this single objective. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let's ease into today's history journey together. Vienna was not symbolic. It was the hinge. If it opened, the rest would follow. The man who commanded the Ottoman forces understood this with absolute clarity. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had spent 18 months preparing for this campaign, assembling an army that contemporary sources numbered between 100,000 and 300,000 men, though modern historians settle on approximately 140,000 combat effectives, supported by perhaps 40,000 additional labourers, engineers, and camp followers. He brought with him the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that had broken Byzantium and shattered the Balkans. He brought Sipahi cavalry, master gunners from across Anatolia, miners from the Danube provinces, and engineers who had studied every siege from Rhodes to Crete. His supply train stretched for miles. His artillery park contained more than 300 guns. His war chest held enough gold to sustain operations through the following spring if necessary. He did not come to negotiate. He came to wait. Vienna in 1683 was not the imperial capital it would later become. It was a medieval city of perhaps 50,000 civilians pressed against the Danube River, protected by walls that had been reinforced in the previous century, but were not designed to resist modern siege artillery. The garrison commander, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, had approximately 11,000 regular soldiers and 5,000 militia volunteers. He had food for perhaps 2 months, if rationing began immediately. He had enough gunpowder to sustain continuous defensive fire for perhaps 6 weeks. He had no possibility of evacuating the civilian population because the Ottoman advance had been faster than anyone anticipated, and the Danube was already blockaded. By mid-July, the city was surrounded. What followed was not dramatic in the way later paintings would suggest. It was methodical. Kara Mustafa did not order frontal assaults against prepared defenses. He ordered his miners to dig. The Ottomans began sapping operations, tunneling beneath the walls to plant enormous powder charges that would bring down entire sections of fortification. The defenders could hear them underground, scraping and digging, and they dug countermines in response, trying to intercept the tunnels before the charges were set. The city became a geometry problem. Angles of approach, depth of excavation, trajectories of cannon fire. Every day, the Ottoman trenches crept closer. Every night, the engineers calculated how many more feet of wall would have to be rebuilt after the morning's bombardment. Starhemberg understood that he could not win. He could only delay. His orders from Emperor Leopold, who had fled Vienna before the siege began, were simple: hold until relief arrives. But no one knew if relief would come, or when, or in what strength. The Holy Roman Empire was not a unified military power. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, princedoms, and independent cities, each with its own army, budget, and political agenda. Getting them to agree on anything required months of negotiation. Getting them to risk their soldiers in a desperate battle against the most powerful empire in the world required something close to a miracle. The only force capable of making a difference was Poland, and Poland had no obligation to help. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1683 was exhausted. It had spent decades fighting wars on multiple fronts, bleeding money and manpower in conflicts with Sweden, Russia, the Ottomans, and various internal rebellions. Its nobility was fractious, its treasury was empty, and its king, Jan Sobieski, was politically isolated. Sobieski had risen to the throne 11 years earlier as a military hero, the man who had defeated the Ottomans at Kotin in 1673 and saved Poland from invasion. But since becoming king, he had struggled to control the Sejm, the Polish parliament, which was notorious for its liberum veto system that allowed any single delegate to dissolve the entire legislature. He had enemies at court. He had rivals who wanted him dead. He had a kingdom that did not trust him, and a nobility that resented his authority. But Jan Sobieski understood what was happening at Vienna in a way that the fragmented German princes did not. This was not about Austria. This was about whether Europe would survive as a political concept. If Vienna fell, the Ottomans would winter in Austria and strike into Bavaria and Poland in the spring. There would be no second defensive line. There would be no time to raise another army. The war would be over, and the future would belong to Constantinople. So in late August, when messengers from Vienna reached Krakow with desperate pleas for help, Sobieski made a decision that defied political logic. He mobilized the Polish army without full authorization from the Sejm. He emptied the royal treasury to pay for provisions. He called in favors, shamed reluctant nobles into contributing troops, and personally rode from estate to estate recruiting volunteers. He assembled an army of approximately 27,000 men, including 3,000 of the Winged Hussars, the heavy cavalry that had become the symbol of Polish military power. The Winged Hussars were not ordinary cavalry. They were an aristocratic formation, drawn from the Polish nobility, equipped at enormous personal expense with the finest armor, lances, sabers, and horses that wealth could purchase. They wore polished steel breastplates and backs, articulated arm and leg protection, and distinctive feathered wings mounted to their backs or saddles, allegedly to create a terrifying sound in the charge and to protect against lasso attacks from Tatar cavalry. Each hussar was accompanied by retainers and servants, making the formation as much a social institution as a military one. They were trained from childhood to fight on horseback, to absorb the shock of impact, and to break enemy formations through sheer mass and speed. They were expensive, they were proud, and they were utterly committed to Sobieski. But even with the Winged Hussars, Sobieski commanded fewer than 30,000 men. Intelligence reports indicated that Kara Mustafa had at least 140,000. The numerical disparity was so extreme that several of Sobieski's senior commanders privately advised him to reconsider. One battle would not be enough. Even if they reached Vienna, even if they somehow broke the siege, they would be facing an enemy that could absorb catastrophic losses and still maintain numerical superiority. This was suicide. Sobieski's response was not recorded in any single quote, but his actions spoke clearly. He marched. The Polish army left Krakow on August 15th and began the long march south toward Vienna. They moved through the Carpathian passes, through mountain terrain that slowed the artillery train and exhausted the infantry. They moved without adequate maps, relying on local guides who were often unreliable. They moved through late summer heat that killed horses and strained supply lines. And they moved, knowing that every day they delayed increased the chance that Vienna would fall before they arrived. Inside Vienna, the situation was collapsing. By early September, the Ottomans had detonated multiple mine charges, bringing down sections of the wall near the Berg Bastion and the Lobel Bastion. Turkish infantry poured through the gaps, and hand-to-hand fighting raged in the rubble. Starhemberg threw in his last reserves, pulling men from other sections of the wall to plug the breaches. The defenders held, barely, but they could not hold indefinitely. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Ammunition was running critically low. Disease was spreading through the cramped city. Morale was fracturing. Some civilians were beginning to talk about surrender. Starhemberg sent another messenger through the Ottoman lines, a rider who somehow evaded patrols and rode north toward the last known position of the relief force. The message was brief. If you do not arrive within days, the city will fall. Sobieski received the message on September 8th. His army was still miles from Vienna, moving through forested hills north of the city. He did not know the exact disposition of the Ottoman forces. He did not know whether the Austrians and Germans had managed to assemble their contingents. He did not know if there would be time to coordinate a unified attack. But he knew that if he waited to gather more intelligence, to hold more councils of war, to ensure perfect conditions, Vienna would be gone. He ordered the march to continue through the night. On September 11th, 1683, the combined relief army assembled on the Kahlenberg Heights overlooking Vienna, and for the first time, the commanders could see the full scope of what they faced. The Ottoman camp stretched across the plain below like a second city, larger than Vienna itself, a sprawling maze of tents, artillery positions, supply depots, and cavalry corrals that extended for miles in every direction. Smoke rose from hundreds of cook fires. Banners marked the positions of different regiments and provincial levies. The siege works formed concentric rings around the city walls, layers of trenches and earthworks that had been refined over 2 months of continuous engineering. And behind it all, Vienna itself sat silent and broken, its walls breached in multiple locations, smoke rising from fires that had been burning for days. From the heights, it was impossible to tell if anyone inside was still alive. Sobieski stood with the other commanders and studied the terrain. The relief force had grown as it approached Vienna. German princes had contributed their contingents. The Duke of Lorraine had brought imperial troops. Saxon and Bavarian regiments had arrived. In total, the combined Christian army numbered approximately 65,000 to 70,000 men. It was still outnumbered, but not catastrophically. The real problem was coordination. This was not a unified force under a single command structure. It was a coalition of rival powers, each with its own objectives, hierarchies, and political constraints. The Germans distrusted the Poles. The Austrians resented Sobieski's assumption of authority. The smaller contingents were reluctant to commit to a frontal assault without guarantees about who would bear the casualties. But there was no time for prolonged negotiation. Everyone understood that Vienna could fall at any moment. Starhemberg had sent word that the garrison was fighting in the rubble of the walls themselves, that the Ottomans were inside the outer defences, and that unless relief came immediately, the city would be lost before nightfall. Sobieski proposed a plan that was tactically simple and operationally insane. The Allied army would descend from the Kahlenberg heights in a coordinated assault, with infantry advancing through the forested slopes to engage the Ottoman left wing while the cavalry, held in reserve, would sweep around the flank and strike the centre of the Ottoman camp. The goal was not to destroy the Ottoman army. That was impossible. The goal was to create enough chaos and panic that Kara Mustafa would be forced to abandon the siege and withdraw to regroup. The other commanders agreed, not because the plan was sound, but because there was no alternative. The attack began in the early morning of September 12th. German and Austrian infantry descended the wooded slopes in columns, engaging Ottoman skirmishers and forward positions. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Ottoman troops, many of whom had been rotated away from the siege lines for rest, were caught off guard by the speed and aggression of the assault. But they did not break. Janissaries moved into position, forming defensive lines and returning disciplined volley fire. Ottoman artillery, which had been aimed at the city walls, was hastily redirected toward the slopes. The Allied advance slowed, bogged down in dense forest and broken terrain where cavalry could not operate and artillery had limited effectiveness. For several hours, the outcome was uncertain. The Allied infantry made incremental progress, pushing the Ottomans back from the forward positions, but they could not break through to the main camp. Casualties mounted on both sides. Units became disorganized in the forest. Communication between different Allied contingents broke down. By midday, the assault was stalling, and some commanders began to consider the possibility that they had committed to a battle they could not win. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg could hear the sounds of fighting to the north, and understood that the relief force had arrived. He ordered every remaining soldier in the garrison to prepare for a sortie. If the besiegers were distracted by the attack from the heights, this might be the only opportunity to break out and link up with the Allied army. But the garrison was barely functional. Men who had been fighting continuously for 2 months, surviving on reduced rations, suffering from wounds and dysentery and exhaustion, were being asked to launch an offensive against an enemy that still vastly outnumbered them. Some could barely stand. Some had no ammunition left. Some had already accepted that they were going to die and were simply waiting for the end. Starhemberg walked through the rubble and spoke to them quietly, telling them that if they did not move now, everything they had endured would be meaningless. He did not appeal to glory or honor. He appealed to survival. If you want to live, he told them, this is the moment. On the Kahlenberg heights, Sobieski watched the infantry battle unfold and understood that incremental progress would not be enough. The Ottomans were not panicking. They were adjusting, reinforcing weak points, repositioning reserves. If the Allies continued grinding forward through the forest, the battle would devolve into a stalemate, and Kara Mustafa would have time to organize a counterattack or simply hold his position until nightfall, at which point the Allied army would have to withdraw or risk being cut off. Sobieski needed a decisive action, something that would shatter Ottoman cohesion before they could stabilize. He ordered the cavalry to prepare to charge. The decision was met with immediate objection from several Allied commanders. The terrain was still partially wooded. The Ottoman positions were not fully exposed. Committing the cavalry without clear lanes of advance risked disaster. Cavalry charges were devastating when executed against broken or fleeing infantry, but charging into prepared positions, especially positions defended by Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry, was a gamble that could result in the entire mounted force being destroyed in minutes. Sobieski listened to the objections and did not argue. He simply said that the charge would proceed and that he would lead it personally. At approximately 5 in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Allied cavalry began moving down from the heights. They came in waves, regiments forming into columns and then spreading into lines as the terrain opened. German cuirassiers, Austrian heavy cavalry, Polish panzerni, and at the center, the Winged Hussars. Approximately 18,000 horsemen in total, the largest cavalry formation assembled in Europe in decades. The ground trembled as they descended. The sound was not a thunderous roar, as later romanticized accounts would claim, but something deeper and more visceral, a continuous rumble that could be felt in the chest, the rhythmic impact of thousands of hooves striking earth in imperfect unison. Kara Mustafa, positioned near the center of the Ottoman camp, received reports of the cavalry movement and initially dismissed it as a feint or a repositioning maneuver. Cavalry did not charge entrenched positions. Cavalry exploited breakthroughs created by infantry. The reports made no tactical sense, and he assumed his forward commanders were misinterpreting what they were seeing. By the time he understood that the charge was real, it was too late to reposition his reserves. The Winged Hussars hit the Ottoman left flank first, and the impact was not subtle. These were not light cavalry harassing and withdrawing. These were fully armored men on heavy war horses, moving at full gallop, holding lances that were over 5 meters long and designed to transfer the entire momentum of horse and rider into a single point of impact. The first line of Ottoman infantry, composed of regional levies who had been moved into position to reinforce the Janissaries, simply disintegrated. Men were thrown backward, trampled, or scattered. The Hussars did not stop. They drove through the first line, dropped their shattered lances, drew sabres, and continued into the second line. The charge did not unfold as a single elegant maneuver. It was chaotic, brutal, and fragmentary. Different cavalry units hit different sections of the Ottoman line at slightly different times. Some encountered heavier resistance and were forced to wheel away. Some broke through completely and found themselves isolated deep inside the Ottoman camp. Some collided with Sipahi cavalry and fought desperate mounted duels, but the cumulative effect was overwhelming. The Ottoman left wing, which had been holding against the Allied infantry, suddenly found itself fighting on 2 fronts, and cohesion began to collapse. Kara Mustafa ordered his Janissaries to form square and hold the center, and for a time, they did. These were professional soldiers, veterans of decades of campaigns, and they did not panic easily. They formed defensive formations, maintained fire discipline, and inflicted horrific casualties on the cavalry units that tried to break them. But they were now fighting, while the rest of the army was disintegrating around them. Supply lines were cut, artillery crews were abandoning their guns, camp followers were fleeing toward the Danube, and the Janissaries, no matter how disciplined, could not hold indefinitely against an enemy that was now attacking from multiple directions. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg launched his sortie. The garrison, broken and exhausted, poured out of the breaches and attacked the nearest Ottoman siege positions. They had no grand strategy. They simply attacked, driven by fury and desperation, and the understanding that this was the last opportunity they would ever have. The Ottoman troops still besieging the city, many of whom had been fighting for hours and had already sustained heavy casualties from the relief assault, found themselves caught between the garrison sortie and the advancing Allied infantry. Some units tried to hold, some tried to retreat, some simply collapsed. By nightfall, the Ottoman army was in full retreat. It was not an organized withdrawal. It was a rout. Kara Mustafa abandoned his camp, his artillery, his supply train, and tens of thousands of troops who were still fighting or trying to surrender. He fled south toward Hungary with whatever cavalry he could gather. leaving behind a sprawl of abandoned equipment, treasure, and documents that would take the Allies days to catalogue. The Grand Vizier, who had come to Vienna with the full weight of the Ottoman Empire behind him, left as a fugitive. The sun rose on September 13th, over a battlefield that no longer resembled a siege camp or a military encampment, but rather the scattered remains of a civilization that had been moving forward and had suddenly stopped. Tents stood empty with their flaps open, cook fires still smouldering, food half prepared and abandoned. Artillery pieces, some of the finest bronze guns cast in Ottoman foundries, sat silent in their emplacements. Their crews vanished. Treasure chests lay overturned in the mud, their contents spilling across trampled grass. Banners that had flown over a dozen successful campaigns hung limp on abandoned standards. The Allied soldiers who walked through the wreckage in the early morning light moved carefully, waiting for some final trap to spring. But there was none. The Ottoman army had dissolved in the night, and what remained was the debris of an empire that had discovered its own limit. Jan Sobieski entered Vienna on foot. He did not ride in triumph or accept formal ceremonies. He walked through the breached walls, past rubble that was still warm from fires that had burned for days, past exhausted defenders who sat slumped against shattered fortifications too tired to stand. The city smelled of smoke and rot and human waste. Bodies had not been cleared from the breaches. Sections of wall were still unstable and threatening to collapse. Civilians emerged from cellars and makeshift shelters, blinking in daylight, their faces hollow from hunger and prolonged fear. This was not liberation. This was survival, and survival was not beautiful. Starhemberg met Sobieski near the remains of the Berg bastion, and the two men stood together in silence for a long moment before speaking. Contemporary accounts suggest their conversation was brief and formal. Starhemberg thanked the Polish king for coming. Sobieski replied that he had only done what was necessary. There was no grand speech, no proclamation of victory. Both men understood that what had been prevented was more significant than what had been achieved. Vienna had not fallen. That was all. The fact that it had not fallen meant that Austria still existed, that Poland still had a southern border, that the Holy Roman Empire retained its eastern anchor. But none of these things had been secured permanently. They had simply been postponed. The Allies spent the next several days securing the abandoned Ottoman camp and attempting to calculate what had been lost and what had been captured. The numbers were staggering. The Ottomans had left behind nearly all of their artillery, more than 300 guns of various calibers. They had abandoned supply wagons containing grain, gunpowder, ammunition, and equipment sufficient to sustain a major army for months. They had left behind treasure, including gold coin, silk, jewelry, and ornate weaponry, much of which had been plundered from previous campaigns and was now being plundered again by soldiers who had not been paid in weeks. The value of the captured material was later estimated at millions of florins, enough to finance several years of military operations. But the true cost of the campaign was not measured in gold. Casualty figures from the Battle of Vienna remain disputed, but most historians estimate that the Allies suffered between 2,000 and 4,000 killed and wounded, while Ottoman losses ranged between 15,000 and 20,000, with many more captured or deserted. These numbers, while significant, do not capture the psychological impact of the defeat. The Ottoman Empire had committed its premier field army, led by the Grand Vizier himself, to a campaign that was supposed to break European resistance permanently. That army had been routed by a coalition force that was numerically inferior and hastily assembled. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, which had shaped European military and political thinking for 2 centuries, had been shattered in a single afternoon. Kara Mustafa retreated to Belgrade and attempted to regroup, but the political consequences of his failure were immediate. The Ottoman court in Constantinople did not tolerate defeats of this magnitude. Sultans who presided over catastrophic military losses did not remain in power, and Grand Viziers who lost armies did not receive second chances. In December of 1683, Kara Mustafa was executed by strangulation on the orders of Sultan Mehmed IV. His death was not presented as punishment for incompetence, but as a necessary purification, a severing of the failed limb so that the body could heal. But the body did not heal. The Ottoman Empire would continue to fight Austria and Poland for another 16 years, and it would win individual battles, but it would never again threaten Vienna. The tide had turned, and everyone understood it. For Jan Sobieski, the victory at Vienna represented the apex of his reign and the beginning of its decline. He returned to Poland as the saviour of Christendom, celebrated by the Pope and praised by rulers across Europe. But praise did not translate into political power. The Polish nobility, which had resented his military authority before Vienna, resented it even more afterward. The Sejm continued to obstruct his policies. Rivals continued to undermine his authority. And the financial cost of the campaign, which Sobieski had partially funded from his own resources, left the royal treasury in ruins. He spent the final years of his reign fighting smaller wars, managing internal rebellions, and watching his health deteriorate. When he died in 1696, Poland was no stronger than it had been before Vienna. It was, if anything, more fragmented and more vulnerable. The victory had bought time, but time was all it had bought. The Winged Hussars, who had become the symbolic embodiment of the charge that broke the Ottoman siege, continued to serve in the Polish army for another century, but their military relevance gradually diminished. Cavalry charges, no matter how devastating, could not compete with the evolving technologies of gunpowder warfare. By the mid-18th century, the Hussars had become an anachronism, a ceremonial formation maintained more for tradition than tactical utility. The wings were retired, the armour was stored, the great estates that had supported the noble cavalrymen were divided and sold, and the memory of the charge itself became a story told to children, a moment when Poland had mattered, when the Commonwealth had stood at the centre of European survival rather than at its periphery. Vienna itself transformed in the decades following the siege. The walls were rebuilt, stronger and more extensive than before. The city expanded beyond its medieval core, becoming the imperial capital that the Habsburgs had always envisioned. Baroque palaces replaced medieval fortifications. The population grew, trade flourished, and within 2 generations, the siege of 1683 had become a historical curiosity, something commemorated in paintings and monuments, but disconnected from the lived experience of the people who walked the streets. The breaches were repaired so thoroughly that it became impossible to see where they had been. But the deeper transformation was not architectural. It was psychological. After Vienna, Europe stopped treating the Ottoman Empire as an existential threat and began treating it as a rival power that could be managed, negotiated with, and occasionally defeated. The border between Christendom and Islam, which had been fluid and terrifying for centuries, stabilized. The age of great Islamic expansion into Europe ended not with a treaty or a proclamation, but with the quiet recognition that the momentum had shifted. The Ottomans would remain a formidable empire for another 2 centuries, controlling vast territories and commanding significant military resources, but they would never again inspire the kind of civilizational fear that had driven Sobieski to march his army across the Carpathians in the late summer of 1683. The irony, which historians have noted repeatedly, is that the victory at Vienna did not save Europe in any permanent sense. It delayed a particular outcome. It prevented a specific catastrophe. But the forces that had brought the Ottomans to the gates of Vienna, the competition for territory, the clash of empires, the struggle for dominance, those forces did not disappear. They simply found new expressions. Within a century, Europe would be tearing itself apart in wars that made the Ottoman campaigns look modest by comparison. The 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the World Wars. The threat would always come from somewhere, and the victories would always be temporary. What remains, stripped of myth and national pride and religious triumphalism, is a single image. 3,000 horsemen in ornamental armor, wings mounted to their backs, descending a hillside in the late afternoon sun, while an empire that believed itself inevitable watched and did not understand what it was seeing until the moment of impact. The charge lasted perhaps 30 minutes. The consequences unfolded over centuries. And the lesson, if there is one, is not about courage or faith or divine intervention. It is about the fragility of dominance. Empires do not fall because they are weak. They fall because they become incapable of imagining that they could fall. They march their armies across continents, besiege cities, deploy overwhelming force, and assume that patience and resources will deliver victory. And then something moves faster than they expected, strikes harder than they calculated, and the entire structure collapses not because it was broken, but because it was confident. Vienna stands today as a monument to survival, but survival is not the same as triumph. The city endured because a small number of exhausted men held walls that were crumbling beneath them, and because a king from a fractured kingdom decided that some things were worth risking everything to prevent. They did not save civilization. They postponed its reckoning. And in the long arc of history, postponement is all that anyone ever achieves. The threats return, the sieges resume. The choice between resistance and collapse presents itself again and again, in different forms, under different banners, and the outcome is never certain. The story of Vienna is not finished because the question it posed has never been answered. When the overwhelming force arrives, when the siege begins, when the walls start to crack, and the food runs out and help seems impossible, what separates those who hold from those who surrender? It is not strength. It is not numbers. It is something smaller and more personal, a refusal to accept that the outcome has already been decided, a stubbornness that looks like faith but might just be the inability to imagine doing anything else. Sobieski had it. Starhemberg had it. The men who charged down the Kahlenberg had it. And when it mattered, when everything hung on a single afternoon in September, it was enough. But it was only enough for that day.